From a Yale-educated star, found passed out in a rabbit hutch, to the icon who thought the ocean was made of blue paint, Golden Age studios went to extreme lengths to hide the intellectual darkness of their biggest figures. Today, we're exposing the logic handlers and secret languages used to mask the shocking confusion behind Hollywood's most perfect faces. Jayne Mansfield, the genius who wasn't considered the case of Jayne Mansfield, a woman whose entire public identity was a masterclass in the studio's ability to create a high-functioning illusion. The publicity machines of the 1950s sold us a fantasy that movie stars were as brilliant as they were beautiful, promoting Jayne as a complete package with a supposedly sky-high intelligence quotient of 163. Publicity photos showed her reading complex philosophy books while soaking in bubble baths. But the moment the camera stopped clicking, the illusion vanished. Those who worked closely with her, from makeup artists to veteran directors, whispered about a woman who seemed fundamentally unable to grasp the world around her. She was a woman who could supposedly speak 5 languages, yet struggled to navigate the basic geography of her own country. On one occasion, Mansfield turned to the crew and asked, with complete sincerity, why the studio didn't simply move the state of California closer to New York City so that the actors wouldn't have to endure such long airplane flights. She wasn't playing a character in that moment. She was expressing a genuine lack of geographical understanding that left the room in stunned silence. The crew members exchanged glances, realizing that the woman they were filming was worlds away from the intellectual giant the fan magazines described. This was a woman who reportedly spent thousands of dollars on a pink mansion and heart-shaped swimming pools. Yet she lacked the basic spatial awareness to realize that cross-country travel required crossing a continent. She would often stare blankly at maps in the studio travel office, unable to comprehend why a drive to the East Coast took days rather than minutes. Her personal assistant later remarked that Jayne once spent 20 minutes trying to fit a square suitcase into a round closet, convinced that the laws of geometry were merely suggestions made by the set designers. Studio executives had to hire a full-time logic handler for her, someone whose sole job was to prevent her from revealing her confusion to the high society circles she was forced to frequent. During a promotional tour for a European film release, her grasp of world geography became a source of quiet embarrassment for her handlers, who were constantly hovering nearby to catch her verbal stumbles. She allegedly asked a British journalist if the continent of Europe ever experienced a summer season, or if the entire landmass was perpetually subjected to English weather. The journalist initially assumed she was leaning into her famous unintelligent persona, but the laughter died away when she followed up by asking if Paris was merely a neighborhood where many British people resided. This disconnect from reality was not merely a quirk. It was a profound limitation that made filming nearly impossible. The tragedy of Mansfield's career was the exhausting effort required to maintain the lie of her genius while working under the harsh lights of a studio that knew the truth. One director, reaching his breaking point after she failed to grasp a simple blocking instruction for the 20th time, eventually developed a primitive, color-coded system to get through a day of filming. He would tell her, "Jayne, this is a blue scene," which was her cue to look sad. Or, "This is a red scene," signifying anger. Anything more complex than primary emotions or basic colors was simply beyond her reach. He found that if he used the word melancholy or resentful, her eyes would simply glaze over in confusion. On one set, he attempted to explain the concept of irony. But after an hour, Jayne simply asked if irony was the name of the new leading man. This intellectual gap meant that her performances had to be constructed in the editing room, piece by painful piece, as she struggled to hold a single thought in her head long enough for the camera to capture it. Yet, she clung to the narrative of her intellect with a desperate, almost heartbreaking grip. She would memorize large, academic words from a dictionary and drop them into dinner conversations with the city's elite, only to use them in ways that made no sense, leading to moments of awkward quiet where a brief flash of panic would cross her eyes as she realized she had failed the test yet again. These instances of verbal confusion were often dismissed by the public as charming Jayne-isms. But in the high-stakes world of movie production, they were expensive and exhausting delays. Script supervisors noted that she frequently tried to correct their grammar using rules she had completely fabricated, insisting that certain words sounded more intelligent when pronounced with a silent letter that didn't exist. She even attempted to discuss quantum physics with studio heads, using phrases she had heard in a radio play, unaware that she was speaking absolute gibberish. Her eventual passing in a car collision in 1967 only added to the weight of a life spent trying to prove she was something the studios would never truly let her be, leaving behind a legacy of a woman who was a genius only in the eyes of a carefully deceived public. Even her final farewell was a spectacle of the very glamour she struggled to understand. A final curtain call for a woman who lived her life as a scripted character, forever trapped between the genius she wanted to be and the bombshell she was forced to play. Sonny Tufts, the human punchline. But if Mansfield was a woman struggling to reach for a genius she didn't possess, our next star was a man who possessed every advantage of birth and threw it all away in a children's petting zoo. Sonny Tufts was a man who, on paper, should have been the crown jewel of any studio roster, representing the ultimate American pedigree. Born into a prominent Boston banking family and educated at the prestigious Yale University, he possessed the square-jawed, athletic looks of a classic leading man that the 1940s demanded. However, Sonny Tufts quickly became known within the industry as a human punchline, a man whose name became shorthand for a specific kind of professional incompetence that left even the most seasoned directors speechless. A production manager at Paramount Pictures, who had seen everything in his 30-year career, described him as a perfect storm of confusion and intoxication. Tufts seemed to exist in a permanent state of disorientation, often unable to distinguish between his real life and the sets he inhabited. He once arrived on a film set ready to work, in full costume, only to be told he was not only on the wrong stage, but was attempting to walk into a movie he wasn't even cast in. Rather than apologizing for the mistake, Tufts argued with the director, his voice rising in indignation, insisting, "Look at my face. I'm the star, so this must be my movie." The director, a veteran of dozens of productions, simply stared in disbelief as Tufts wandered through the wrong lighting setups, oblivious to the fact that he was wasting thousands of dollars worth of resources. He would frequently try to rewrite his lines on the fly, resulting in gibberish that sounded like a man speaking in a foreign tongue. On one occasion, he spent 3 hours arguing that a tree on the set was actually a disguised spy from a rival studio, and he refused to perform until the tree was questioned by the security guards. His confusion extended to the very nature of time and space, often clashing with the rigid schedules of the studio era. During a high-stakes war bonds tour across the country, he reportedly complained about being asked to appear at morning events to support the troops, suggesting that the United States military should simply reschedule its entire activities to the late afternoon to accommodate his sleeping patterns. He genuinely believed that the timing of the conflict could be adjusted for his convenience, asking a colonel if they could hold off on the fighting until he had finished his second pot of coffee. But it was his behavior at a high-profile Hollywood charity event, meant to showcase the elegance of the stars, that truly sealed his reputation. After consuming a significant amount of spirits behind the scenes, Tufts wandered away from the gala and was later found unconscious in a children's petting zoo, with small, alarmed rabbits reportedly hopping over his resting body. The image of the Yale-educated leading man passed out among farm animals was too much for the studio to bury, despite their best efforts to bribe the photographers present. It was whispered that when he finally regained consciousness, his first question was why the rabbits hadn't asked for his autograph. He reportedly spent the rest of the evening trying to convince a goat that he could secure a contract at MGM, promising the animal a starring role in a musical. The situation became so dire that Paramount took the unprecedented step of issuing a public apology for his behavior after a particularly disastrous appearance where he made inappropriate remarks to the spouses of servicemen. The studio's statement essentially washed their hands of him, an admission that their leading man was a liability they could no longer control. Directors eventually treated him like a child, breaking his scenes down into single lines of dialogue because he lacked the mental capacity to hold a conversation in character. They would film one sentence, stop the camera, move the lighting, and film the next. It was a tedious, expensive way to work that drained the studio's resources, and the industry eventually grew tired of the Yale man who couldn't be reasoned with as effectively as a trained animal. Crew members began placing bets on how long it would take for Sonny to forget the single sentence he had just been told, and unfortunately, the odds were rarely in his favor. He would often look at the camera and ask, "What am I doing here?" in the middle of a dramatic take. One cameraman recalled that Sonny once spent an entire lunch break trying to start a conversation with his own reflection in a water pitcher, growing increasingly frustrated when the other actor wouldn't stop mimicking him. He would end his days wandering the studio backlots, asking anyone he met if they knew where the man in the pitcher had gone, a hauntingly sad end for a man who had once been destined for greatness. Mamie Van Doren, the girl who lost time. The theme of the confused blonde was a staple of the 1950s, but few stars inhabited that role with as much genuine, unintentional conviction as Mamie Van Doren. As the studios searched for a replacement for Marilyn Monroe, they elevated Van Doren to stardom, surrounding her with the usual trappings of glamour and perceived sophistication that the public craved. However, for the publicists tasked with managing her image, every unscripted interview was a high-stakes exercise in damage control that frequently failed. Van Doren's grasp of history and reality was so tenuous that it became the stuff of Hollywood legend among the press corps. During a press event for a war film set in the 1940s, she told a reporter that she believed the Second World War had taken place in the 1970s. When the reporter gently pointed out that they were currently living in the 1950s, making her timeline impossible, she simply looked puzzled and asked if he was certain about the dates. This wasn't a temporary lapse in memory. It was a consistent pattern of profound intellectual disconnect. She famously argued that Abraham Lincoln was the inventor of the telephone, and when corrected with the name Alexander Graham Bell, she identified him as the man who rang the Liberty Bell to announce American freedom, seemingly incapable of distinguishing between different eras of the American story. She once reportedly asked a script supervisor if they could shoot a scene in black and white while the rest of the movie was in color, simply because she liked the way her dress looked in the older format. She also believed that the ocean was made of blue paint and would ask crew members when they were going to refill the sea. Her confusion about the natural world extended to her own career. She once asked why the moon didn't have her face on it, since the studio had promised she would be the biggest star in the night sky. She would frequently attempt to fix the set lighting by blowing on the heavy studio lamps, convinced that they were candles that just needed a bit of air. The studio's solution was to turn her into a living, breathing puppet, stripped of her own thoughts to protect the bottom line. For press tours, they had her memorize exactly 5 approved responses that were vague enough to fit almost any situation. No matter what a journalist asked, whether it was about the political climate or her acting technique, she was trained to repeat one of those 5 statements with a practiced smile. It was a primitive form of artificial intelligence, a human being reduced to a series of pre-recorded messages because the reality of her thoughts was considered too damaging to the brand. This level of management was so extreme that she was rarely allowed to speak to anyone without a studio minder standing within earshot. If a reporter asked a question outside of her training, she would simply reboot and start the list over again, sometimes answering a question about her favorite food with a rehearsed statement about the importance of international cinema. Studio handlers would often use hand signals behind the reporter's back to tell her which of the 5 sentences to use, treating her more like a trained parrot than a leading lady. Perhaps the most poignant evidence of her confusion came years later in her autobiography, which was meant to set the record straight, but only deepened the mystery. The book was a maze of chronological errors and fabricated accounts, describing meetings with people who had passed away years before the events she described. She would describe intimate conversations with stars who were already in the ground, seemingly unaware of the impossibility. Like Mansfield, Van Doren had a genuine, palpable desire to be taken seriously as a thinking woman. She would attend industry parties and try to lean into conversations about literature or politics. But the things she said were so disconnected from fact that the room would simply go cold, and people would slowly back away. She once interrupted a discussion on the Cold War to ask if the Soviet Union was that place where they keep the polar bears. She also suggested that the United Nations could solve their problems by simply giving everyone a nice silk scarf. When someone mentioned the Iron Curtain, she asked if it was heavy and if it needed to be dry cleaned. The studio eventually issued a standing order to every crew member: keep the camera on her to capture her beauty, but keep the microphone away at all costs. Every script she received was simplified until it contained mostly stage directions and only a handful of words she could easily pronounce. This forced silence created a mysterious aura that the public mistook for sophistication, never realizing it was a shield to hide a mind that was profoundly lost. It is a reminder of the many stars who were treated as decorative objects, their humanity sacrificed for the sake of a silent, beautiful image. Tony Curtis, the master of volume. If you think Mamie Van Doren's historical confusion was shocking, wait until you hear how Tony Curtis tried to improve Shakespeare. But before we get to the man who thought he was smarter than the bard, please consider subscribing to our channel. We are dedicated to preserving the real history of the Golden Age, and your support helps us continue this journey into the dark corners of cinematic legend. While some stars struggled with the basics of history or geography, Tony Curtis faced a war of wills with the very essence of the artistic craft. Curtis was undeniably one of the most bankable and beloved leading men of the 1950s and 60s. Yet he famously described the art of acting as just talking loud with style. This wasn't a humble joke or a moment of self-deprecation. It was his sincere interpretation of his professional life. He saw the complex work of his peers as unnecessary fluff, believing that as long as he was the loudest person in the room, he was the best actor. He often mocked the method actors of his generation, unable to understand why anyone would want to analyze their childhood just to play a scene in a Western. He believed that acting was a physical contest rather than an intellectual one, often challenging his co-stars to arm wrestling matches to prove who should have the most lines in a scene. On the set of one film, he refused to listen to the director's advice because he claimed he could hear his own talent, and it was louder than any instructions. During the filming of the epic Spartacus, the legendary director Stanley Kubrick, a man known for his obsessive attention to detail and intellectual rigor, found himself in a psychological battle that tested his legendary composure. He reportedly had to spend hours explaining the meaning of basic words to Curtis, who looked at the script as if it were written in an ancient, dead language. Kubrick's patience was tested to its limit as he tried to explain character, motivation, and the political subtext of the Roman Empire, only to have Curtis suggest, "Can I just say the lines louder? That always works for me in comedies." Kubrick was forced to use visual metaphors because Curtis simply could not process abstract concepts. His confusion regarding the great works of literature was equally famous among the Hollywood elite. When cast in adaptations of classic novels, he once suggested that a script based on a masterpiece of world literature needed to be spiced up because the original author didn't really know how to tell an engaging story, completely unaware of the author's status as a global genius. On another occasion, he described William Shakespeare as a man who used weird grammar, and he seriously suggested to a stunned production team that the dialogue be translated into normal English to make it easier for him to deliver. He once walked onto a set and asked if they could change the ending of a tragedy because he thought it would be better if everyone went to a party instead. He was also known for asking if classic historical figures like Napoleon were still around and if they could visit the set for a photo opportunity. On the set of a period drama, he famously asked the costume designer why people in the olden days didn't just buy zippers instead of using buttons. He genuinely believed that historical people were simply modern people who had forgotten how to use modern technology. Despite these staggering limitations, Curtis had a natural, instinctive, emotional connection to the camera that defied his lack of book learning. If a director used simple, one-syllable instructions and treated him like a technician rather than an artist, he could produce a performance of surprising power. He was a man who succeeded through raw, unstudied charisma that the studio system knew exactly how to package for a public that never saw the man behind the volume. He was a master of the gaze, able to look intensely at a co-star while his mind was completely blank, thinking about what he wanted for dinner while the director captured what looked like profound inner turmoil. His career was a victory of appearance over intellect, a triumph of the pretty face in a world that rarely asked for anything more. Tab Hunter, the heartthrob who couldn't find his mark. The story of Tab Hunter offers a different perspective on the manufactured star, moving from a battle of intellect to the tragedy of a human puppet controlled by invisible strings. In the 1950s, Warner Brothers viewed Tab Hunter as a valuable piece of property to be maintained like a classic car. He was the quintessential teen idol, a golden boy for the post-war era. But the image of the confident young man was entirely a creation of the publicity department. In reality, Hunter struggled so deeply with technical requirements that crews had to develop a secret language that looked like a military operation. He often could not remember his blocking, which is the basic movement an actor takes across a set. He would wander in the wrong direction, bumping into furniture or standing in the shadows where the expensive lighting couldn't find him. To solve this, the production crew didn't just put tape on the floor. They created an elaborate system of hand signals from behind the camera that had to be rehearsed as much as the lines. A crew member would tug their ear to tell him to speak, or tap their nose to tell him to look at his co-star, or point at the floor to remind him to move. It was less like directing an Oscar-worthy performance, and more like guiding a confused person through a dangerous maze. The cameramen were often the most frustrated, as Tab would repeatedly miss his focus marks, causing expensive retakes that stretched long into the night. They eventually started using strings and pulleys to literally pull him into position during wide shots, a humiliating necessity for a man who was supposed to be a star. His difficulty with dialogue was just as pronounced and painful for his co-stars to witness. He would memorize lines as individual, disconnected sounds, causing him to place emphasis on the wrong words and making simple sentences sound like they were spoken by an alien trying to pass as human. He had no concept of the rhythm of a conversation, often responding to a question before it was finished or waiting 10 seconds after a line was spoken to react. Most alarming was his short memory. During high-stakes press tours for million-dollar films, he would often have to look at a cheat sheet hidden in his lap just to remember the name of his character or what the movie was actually about, despite having spent months on the set. On one occasion, a reporter asked him what he liked most about his character's journey, and Tab had to lean down and whisper to his publicist to find out if he was playing a soldier or a sailor in that specific film. He once even forgot his own stage name during a live radio interview, referring to himself by his real name, Arthur, and confusing the entire audience who had no idea who Arthur was. He also struggled to understand why he couldn't wear his favorite neon-colored socks in a film set in the 19th century, arguing that they were much more comfortable than the wool stockings the costume department provided. He once asked a director if the cameras could see his thoughts, and when told no, he expressed great relief, admitting he had forgotten everything they had discussed that morning. The studio executives were fully aware of these challenges, but they didn't care about his intellectual growth. To them, Tab Hunter was a product that sold tickets and glossy magazines. They paired him with the most patient, technical directors and ensured he was never put in a position where he had to think for himself or answer a complex question. He was a prisoner of his own beauty, a man who signed contracts he didn't understand and lived a life he couldn't quite wrap his mind around, all to satisfy the demands of an industry that saw him as a beautiful, empty vessel to be filled with whatever fantasy the public desired. We would love to hear from you in the comments section. Which of these revelations has surprised you the most so far? The Yale man in the rabbit hutch? Or the bombshell who lost her place in time? Perhaps it was the leading man who couldn't remember which movie he was starring in while he was sitting in the interview chair. Or perhaps you were shocked by the color-coded directing needed to get Jayne Mansfield through a single scene. And looking ahead, what other topics from the golden age of Hollywood would you like us to explore in our future videos? We are building this channel together, and your feedback helps us shape the stories we tell. Every comment helps us bring more hidden truths to light. We read every word you write, as your curiosity is the engine that drives this channel forward into the past. Hedy Lamarr, the brilliant mind who outsmarted everyone. However, the history of Hollywood is also filled with instances where the unintelligence wasn't in the star, but in the industry's refusal to see the brilliance right in front of them because it didn't fit the script. Hedy Lamarr is the ultimate climax of this irony. A woman whose beauty was so great, it acted as a mask for a mind that was decades ahead of its time. In the 1940s, she was marketed as the most beautiful woman in the world. But behind the scenes, she was developing a revolutionary frequency hopping system designed to protect radio-guided torpedoes from being jammed by the enemy. While she was being dismissed by directors who told her not to worry her pretty little mind about the technical aspects of filmmaking or the mechanics of a camera, Lamarr was spending her nights at an inventing table, working with complex blueprints and scientific theories. She even improved the wing design for Howard Hughes's airplanes, though few people at the time took her suggestions seriously. She had a specialized room in her home filled with chemistry sets, engineering tools, and mathematical charts that she called her idea room, a place she retreated to whenever the studio made her feel like a decorative object. She once reportedly solved a complicated engineering problem for Hughes in the back of a limousine on the way to a premiere, scribbling the solution on the back of her invitation. When she tried to present her invention to the United States military to help the effort during their darkest hour, she was mocked by men who could only see her as a pinup. One official told her, "You'd be more useful selling kisses for war bonds than trying to explain torpedoes to the Navy." They literally could not conceive of a woman understanding the physics of a device, let alone a woman who looked like a goddess on a movie screen. Her patent was filed away in a dusty drawer and forgotten, and she was sent back to the studio to play the role of the beautiful but dim, exotic star in films that were beneath her. Even in the company of the world's greatest thinkers like Albert Einstein, her attempts to join scientific discussions were met with a pat on the head and a change of subject. The world simply could not accept that a woman of her beauty could also be a genius who understood the future of communications. She once spent an entire evening trying to explain a new type of traffic light to a group of executives, only to have them tell her that her lipstick was the perfect shade of red. She also developed a tablet that would turn plain water into a carbonated drink, which the studio dismissed as unladylike. She was a genius living in a world of intellectual midgets who were terrified of her brain. The irony of Lamarr's inclusion on this list is that the confusion resided with the men who controlled her career and the society that could only value her skin. She spent her later years as a recluse, watching as the technology she invented eventually became the fundamental basis for the modern world of Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. It is a staggering thought to realize that the smartphone in your pocket relies on technology pioneered by a woman who was told to stand still and look unintelligent. She passed away in Florida, largely forgotten by the industry that had exploited her face while ignoring her mind, having lived a life where her highest achievements were her best-kept secrets. She often told friends that her beauty was a curse that had locked her inside a cage of ignorance created by others. It was only near the end of her existence that she received the recognition she deserved, a reminder that in the golden age, being smart was often a secret more dangerous than any scandal, and that Hollywood's greatest failure was its inability to recognize the brilliance of its own icons. George Raft, the king of bad decisions. In contrast to Lamarr's hidden brilliance, George Raft's career was a testament to the power of consistently, spectacularly poor judgment. Raft was a man who possessed genuine screen presence, and a tough, urban appeal. Yet he is remembered today primarily for a perfect anti-talent for recognizing quality work. Raft famously turned down the lead roles in Casablanca, The Maltese Falcon, and High Sierra. All three of these roles went to Humphrey Bogart, single-handedly transforming Bogart from a struggling character actor into a global legend. Raft's reasons for these rejections revealed a fundamental inability to understand what made a character interesting to an audience. He famously told the producers of Casablanca that the script was rubbish, stating, "This guy talks too much about his feelings. I want to be a tough guy who acts, not a guy who cries in a bar." He even turned down the chance to work with some of the greatest directors of the era because he didn't like the color of the suits his character was supposed to wear, or because the character had a name he thought was too soft. He once refused a role because the script required him to sit down for a 3-minute scene, and he was convinced men of action don't sit down. He actually believed that sitting in a chair would ruin his image as a street-smart tough guy. He couldn't grasp that the internal conflict and the emotional vulnerability were exactly why people would love the character for the next century. His intellectual limitations meant he viewed movies through an incredibly narrow, selfish lens. He wanted to be the hero who never failed, which made for very boring movies. He even requested that scenes where he lost a physical altercation be cut from his films because he thought it would make him look unintelligent in real life, failing to realize that a hero who never struggles is a hero the audience never cares about. This lack of vision cost him millions of dollars in lost earnings. He would take low-paying roles in forgettable, low-budget crime movies simply because the character fit his limited criteria of toughness. When Casablanca won the Academy Award for Best Picture and became a cultural phenomenon, Raft reportedly told friends he still didn't understand what the big deal was about that nightclub movie with all the talking. He once complained that the music was too loud and that the actors were too emotional, missing the entire point of the cinematic experience. He spent his later years telling anyone who would listen that Bogart owed him a percentage of his salary, convinced that Bogart's success was a direct result of Raft's generosity in turning the roles down. He was a man who had the keys to the kingdom in his hands, but was too unwise to recognize the lock, proving that sometimes the biggest hurdle to a legendary career is the person staring back in the mirror. He ended his existence working as a greeter at a casino, still telling stories about how he could have been bigger than Bogey if only the scripts had been better written. Linda Darnell, the beauty who couldn't read her lines. As we look back at these complicated lives, we invite you to like this video and share it with fellow fans of classic cinema who appreciate the truth behind the glamour. Helping these stories reach a wider audience ensures that the human reality of these icons is never forgotten, and that the legends of the past are seen in their full, tragic light. It is through your shares and likes that we can continue to dig through the archives and bring these lost truths to the surface. Your engagement tells the algorithm that people still care about the real history of the silver screen, beyond the carefully curated studio myths. We appreciate every thumbs up, as it helps us keep this history alive for the next generation of film lovers. The struggle with the written word was a particularly painful, silent secret for Linda Darnell, one of the most exquisite beauties of the 1940s. As a major star at 20th Century Fox, she was cast in high-stakes dramas with massive amounts of dialogue. But the start of every film was a period of intense, gut-wrenching anxiety. She struggled with what many now believe was undiagnosed learning challenges, a condition that was essentially unknown and unsupported at the time. The traditional table read, where the cast gathers to read the script aloud, was a source of pure terror for her. She would stumble over basic words, sweat through her expensive costumes, and completely misinterpret her lines in front of her peers. She would often develop physical symptoms, like hives or migraines, just at the sight of a new script delivered to her dressing room. Because the studios had little understanding of learning differences, they simply viewed her as slow or uncooperative. Her co-stars would often grow impatient, as Linda required 5 times longer to read a single page of dialogue than anyone else in the room, leading to a reputation for being difficult that was entirely undeserved. She would often arrive on set with her script completely soaked in tears, having spent all night trying to decode a single scene. Directors dealt with her by spoon-feeding her lines like a child, having her repeat them back dozens of times until she memorized the sounds, even if she didn't fully understand the meaning. This process often took hours of valuable production time, leading to whispers among the crew about her intellectual laziness. They would often tape her lines onto the back of other actors' heads or hide them in vases on the set so she wouldn't have to look at the page. To cope with the shame, Darnell became a master of avoidance, frequently arguing with writers. Do I really need to say all this? Couldn't I just look concerned or walk away instead? Writers and co-stars often thought she was lazy or being a diva, but she was trying to hide a limitation that caused her deep, lasting shame. In her personal life, she avoided books and newspapers entirely to prevent anyone from seeing her struggle, once telling an interviewer that she watched books on airplanes to avoid being caught with one in her hands. She would often carry a newspaper around just for show, but she was rarely actually reading the headlines. She even avoided restaurant menus, always telling the waiter she would have whatever the person next to me is having. She reportedly once turned down a lucrative contract, simply because it was 20 pages long and she couldn't face the prospect of having to read it, choosing lack of funds over the risk of being discovered. She would often memorize the shape of words rather than the letters, a desperate strategy that failed whenever the script was changed at the last minute. She lived in a constant state of fear that her secret would be discovered and her career would end. A beautiful woman, trapped in a world of words she couldn't quite master, forced to perform in a language she could barely read, always one mistake away from being exposed by the very people who worshipped her face. John Derek, the director who thought dialogue gets in the way of beauty. Finally, we come to a different kind of Hollywood shortcoming, the case of John Derek. His career represents the ultimate end of the studio system's obsession with image over substance, where the mind was discarded entirely in favor of the lens. Derek began his career as a handsome actor, but it was his transition to directing that revealed a staggering lack of cinematic intelligence and narrative sense. His entire philosophy of cinema was built around the physical beauty of his wives, most notably Bo Derek, whom he viewed more as a statue than an actress. He famously stated, "Story is what happens between the scenes of unclothed beauty," and believed that dialogue simply gets in the way of beauty, a philosophy that led to some of the most beautiful but empty films ever made. He once directed a film where he forgot to include a climax or a resolution, simply because he was too busy filming a sunset over his wife's shoulder, convinced that the audience would be satisfied with the lighting alone. He believed that a pretty face could replace a plot, and that a well-lit beach was more important than a character arc. He would once spend 3 days filming a single wave crashing against the shore, while his actors sat in their trailers with nothing to do. While directing Tarzan the Aped Man, he told his frustrated crew that sets and background details didn't matter, because nobody is looking at anything but the lead's form anyway. He would choose takes for the final edit based solely on her physical appearance, even if she forgot her lines or the performance was wooden. This led to scenes that made no narrative sense, as characters would enter and exit rooms for no apparent reason other than to be seen by the camera. Derek's inability to understand the fundamentals of narrative led to films that were widely panned and became jokes within the industry. He was genuinely confused by the negative reviews, telling his associates, "She was nearly unclothed for half the movie. What more could they possibly want?" He once argued with a film critic that a movie didn't need a plot as long as the colors were bright and the lead actress was attractive. He would spend entire production meetings talking about lenses and lighting filters while ignoring the fact that his actors didn't have any lines or a reason to be in the scene. He once reportedly asked a scriptwriter to remove all the verbs from a script because they made the actors move too much and messed up the lighting. He genuinely believed that human movement was a distraction from the stillness of beauty. He represents a man who took the glamour of the golden age and stripped away every last shred of human meaning and storytelling, leaving behind nothing but a hollow, beautiful shell that eventually bored the public to tears. He was the director who proved that a movie without a soul is just a collection of expensive photographs. These stories of hidden struggles and manufactured identities remind us that the stars of Hollywood's golden age were, above all else, human beings with flaws, fears, and profound limitations. They were people who dealt with confusion, differences, and the immense, crushing pressure to be something they were not for the sake of the camera. Their brilliance, or their lack of it, was often a tool used by a powerful industry to create a dream for a world that needed to believe in something perfect. When we watch their films today, we are seeing more than just a performance. We are seeing the resilience of people who navigated a world of secrets, shadows, and personal inadequacy to bring those dreams to life. They were icons of a time that valued the mask over the face. But today we can finally look behind the curtain and see the truth. Many of these stars struggled with reliance on substances and heavy sadness, trapped in the very images that made them famous, yet they continued to perform. We see the lines around their eyes and the sadness in their smiles, knowing now the cost of their charmed lives. If you enjoyed this exploration of the human side of the silver screen, please subscribe and join our community of classic film lovers. We are honored to share these journeys into the past, celebrating the full, complicated humanity of the stars who built Hollywood's golden dreams. Thank you for watching, and we look forward to seeing you in our next history, where we will continue to explore the untold stories of the legends we love. Until then, remember that beneath every dazzling smile was a story waiting to be told, and beneath every star was a human being just like you.